Well, good morning, and let me say happy Easter for this Easter Sunday. Our world's pretty much been turned upside down, hasn't it? There's 1.7 million cases of coronavirus that have been confirmed throughout the world. There's probably a lot more than that. And about 100,000 people or more have died. And it's still going. There's isolation, there's fear, there's anxiety, there's lost jobs and businesses. There's just a lot of chaos everywhere, isn't there? This is the biggest disruption that we've ever faced in our lifetime. What other things would turn our world upside down? Probably a fair few. What if someone came back to life after they died? I think that would turn our world upside down, wouldn't it? These are big kinds of challenges to deal with, aren't they? We know this pandemic is real. How about the resurrection? Well, let's read the story of the resurrection, Jesus' resurrection. Bill's going to read it for us in his best Liverpool accent, and I've actually been wondering if Ringo Starr got his accent from Bill. So let's listen to the story read by Bill.
It's Mark 16, verses 1 to 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on the way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, and had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell his disciples and Peter he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
So, 3 of Jesus' followers went to his tomb. They'd been through the trauma of his death on the cross on Friday, but now it's Sunday, and in verse 1, they're planning to put some spices on his body inside the tomb. That was a pretty common practice back then to reduce the smell of decomposing bodies. These 3 women, they really respect Jesus. They see him as their teacher, their Lord, their shepherd. They've spent time together with Jesus on the road. So this is a really sad time for them after Jesus' death on the Friday. And so they're sharing this time together. They're supporting each other through it all. But still, they've got to be feeling grief and trauma, loss, probably shock. And in that state, they encounter 3 big challenges that morning. The first challenge is to do with being able to get inside the tomb. In verse 3, they're talking about who can roll the stone away from the tomb entrance. It's too heavy for them to move themselves. But straight away in verse 4, there's a solution. The big stone has already been rolled away. They don't know who did that. They're thinking, it could have been God. Is it a crane operator? Or who did that? They don't know. And with that question still in their minds, here's their second challenge. Verse 5, Jesus isn't in the tomb anymore. There's someone else there, a young guy in a white robe. Now there's alarm bells ringing in their heads, their ears, when they see him. Where is Jesus? How can he not be here? And just as quickly as the first challenge was sorted out, the second challenge is too. Verse 6, there's a young guy there. He says, look, don't be alarmed. He says, you're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene. And he's right. That's exactly who they're looking for. There's nobody else they're expecting to see there. And the young guy says that Jesus is risen from the dead, that is. He says, see the place where they laid him? And then in verse 7, this young guy says Jesus is on his way to Galilee. And they have to tell Jesus' disciples, including Peter, to meet him there. That's the plan that Jesus set out for them back in Mark chapter 14, when he told them all that they would fall away from him. Jesus, as their shepherd, he'd be struck, and they, as his sheep, would be scattered. So that's something that Zechariah predicted centuries before all this happened. But as Jesus was telling them this challenging news back in Mark chapter 14, he also told them that he'd go ahead of them into Galilee, and right now, in this tomb, this young guy is telling them that Jesus still intends to stick to that plan. He'll see them again soon in Galilee. He'll regather the scattered sheep. He'll pick up where he left off as their caring shepherd again. And so this is really great news for them all, especially Peter, who's deeply distressed about the fact that when the crunch came, he denied even knowing Jesus 3 times. Peter really felt the need to be restored to Jesus. And that's all ahead of them when they see him again in Galilee, just as Jesus planned. Well, over in Matthew chapter 28, where Matthew tells us the same story, we read that this young guy in the tomb is actually an angel. Now, angels are messengers sent by God to deliver messages from God. And this one, it's a whopper of a message. God sent him the startling message that Jesus is alive. And they'll see him again soon as their caring shepherd. They'll need to tell the other disciples the great news about Jesus. This message isn't just for them. They need to pass it on. And then now, there's of course a third challenge. If you look at verse 8 of Mark 16, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They have to get their head around the impossible here, that Jesus is actually alive, even though they saw him dead on Friday. Now, how can that be? Is that even a thing? It's bewildering, isn't it? And not only that, but they're trembling with fear. And no wonder. I mean, angels are scary beings. People often fall down or faint when angels turn up. And so, their adrenaline's pumping and they're trembling. They're overwhelmed. I think all of us would be. No wonder they're too afraid to say anything to anybody. Their world's been turned upside down twice in one weekend. First time when Jesus, their leader, their shepherd, was killed. That was a huge shock for them. Then again, hearing that he's alive. I mean, that's unheard of, right? Until they just heard it from the angel just then. How did that message get from that tomb to us? Well, in verse 8, they didn't say anything to anybody. You're thinking it must have just stuck with them and that's all that happened. But Matthew, he helps us again there in his telling of the same story. He goes a little further along with the events than Mark did. And in Matthew 28, verse 8, they're coming to terms with this challenge. They're both afraid and filled with joy at the same time. So they're running to tell Jesus' disciples this message. In Matthew 28, verse 9, we read that they met Jesus on their way. Actually, Jesus. And that's stunning for them, isn't it? And in verse 10 of chapter 28, he says to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." And they did deliver the message to the other disciples. Over in Luke's telling of the story, we get to chapter 24, final chapter, once again. We get to chapter 24, it's verse 9. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. That takes care of their third challenge. Their message spread to the other disciples and from them to the whole world. In fact, God enabled them to face all 3 challenges. Their world had been turned upside down twice in one weekend. They're trembling, they're afraid, but with God's help, they get the mission done. Well, Easter is still a big challenge. It gives us 3 challenges as well. The first challenge is to accept the impossible, that Jesus actually rose again, that he made a way from death to eternal life. And maybe you've already taken up that challenge. You've come to believe in Jesus as the conqueror of our greatest enemy, death. You've come to accept that Jesus is still alive right now, ruling over everything from heaven. Now, if that's you, then I'm with you. Isn't it great to have real hope, to have the assurance of Jesus' eternal life because of his death? It earned our forgiveness. And his resurrection making a way to eternal life. He gives that to his people. Now, in the face of a pandemic, you know you have hope. The threat of death of this pandemic, it's empty for you, isn't it? Or maybe you've written off Jesus' resurrection as some kind of old wives' tale, something made up by people who talk to an imaginary sky fairy or something. You believe it didn't actually happen, or maybe you never really thought about it. You figure you'll be okay when you die without Jesus. And so I want to challenge you to consider this. How do you know it didn't actually happen? Or that it doesn't really matter? Jesus kept doing impossible things right in front of people's eyes during his lifetime. And this is another one, to conquer death for his people. Are you sure that that did not happen? Are you sure you'll be okay without him? The second Easter challenge for us is to accept that this eternal life is for anybody who wants it, that it can be for you and everybody that you know. We saw earlier on that Peter was in a bad way because he denied even knowing Jesus 3 times when the crunch came. But when Jesus conquered death, he's back to life. What does he say? He wants Peter to come and meet with him. And when they do meet, what does Jesus do? Over in John chapter 21, Jesus restores Peter to his important leadership position. He doesn't just have eternal life, he's actually a leader in a movement that spreads the message of eternal life through Jesus, to the whole world. If eternal life is for Peter, it can be for anyone. Even us on the other side of the world, 2 millenniums later, living in another culture, speaking another language, we can have that eternal life right here, right now, because Jesus invites us to ask him for it. Well, the third Easter challenge is to accept that we can actually live this eternal life here and now. We may be afraid yet filled with joy like those ladies at that tomb. Afraid, well, because eternal life is all about living God's way, takes time to get used to not living your own way. And full of joy, well, because it's such a great way to live. It's how God designed us all to live in the first place. But think about those 3 ladies who visited the tomb. Their world had been turned upside down twice in one weekend. They don't know how they'll get into the tomb. They're alarmed when Jesus isn't there. They're trembling with fear when they leave the tomb with the mission to tell the message that Jesus is alive, the one that's shocking for them even at that moment. But God helps them get it done. Despite not knowing and being alarmed and trembling with fear, eternal life is God's way of life for us. And so he helps us to live it. And so let me ask you, will you take up the Easter challenge? Will you look to God to help you believe the impossible, that Jesus conquered death and made a way to eternal life? Will you look to God and ask him to give you eternal life? Will you look to God and ask him to help you live that eternal life? Or maybe you're interested in finding out a little bit more before you figure all that stuff out. I'd be really, really pleased to help you. And you could get that started by emailing me at john.mullumpc@gmail.com. I'd love it if I could help you. Please do consider emailing me.